Hello everyone, I recently hit 2 big milestones on this channel. A couple months ago I surpassed 1,000 subscribers, and thank you guys so much. I honestly never thought I'd get here. I'm glad that y'all have been enjoying what I've put out so far, and I'll keep doing my best to make better content for you in the future. The other milestone is that July 12th was my 10-year anniversary on YouTube. Most of my older videos are privated now, but I've been doing this gig for a long time, and to finally start seeing just a little bit of success with it, it's quite the feeling. Since these two events were creeping up and the Enslaved video was taking far longer than I had initially anticipated, I decided to do this little passion project in the meantime. These are my top 24 games of all time. I thought for a while about how I want to order this list, whether I should go with subjectivity, objectivity, or my usual mix of both, but in this case I decided to go with my gut feeling. This is not a definitive list of the best games of all time, they're just the games that I'm the most passionate about and the games that mean the most to me. I'm also only considering the single-player component of these games. There are no multiplayer games on this list, even if a game on this list has multiplayer. Savvy? Finally, though this should go without saying, none of these games are above reproach. However, I'm going to try and stay away from criticism, as this is not a review video. So, with the preamble out of the way, please excuse me while I gush for a while. Number 24. Unravel. To explain what makes Unravel special, I feel it's necessary to talk a bit about its genre. Unravel is a cinematic platformer, and when I say those words, you may have something like the Uncharted series in mind. Games with bombastic action movie set pieces that are supposed to make you feel like a badass. But cinematic platformers are actually quite the opposite. In these games, you aren't playing as a superpowered Spartan, an unstoppable god of war, or a demon-eviscerating doomslayer. You're just a regular person, with little, if anything, that makes you special. Even when compared with other platformers, you can't jump 50 feet in the air over any obstacle in your path. You need to be careful and deliberate with every move if you want to survive a jump without falling to your death. Beyond that, in many of these games you play as a child, at an inherent power disadvantage to the fully grown adversaries around you. If you have a weapon at all, which is rare, it will be nigh ineffectual, only further serving to punctuate your vulnerability. The worlds of these games are hostile, unforgiving, and filled to the brim with enemies far more powerful than you. If you try to fight them head-to-head, you'll be slaughtered. In some rare cases, you might be able to get the drop on your foes, but most of the time you have two options: run and hide. Even so, death comes quickly, often, and in unforeseeable ways. In a medium that almost universally seeks to make you feel as powerful as possible, cinematic platformers want to make you feel weak, fragile, and isolated. This is where Unravel comes in. You're not playing as a regular guy or even a child. You're a yarn creature, about the size of an apple. Your enemies aren't monsters, dangerous beasts, or other humans, but crows, gophers, water, electricity. In a genre designed to make you feel small, you can't feel much smaller than this. Despite this, it steers clear of grotesque imagery meant to frighten you, and instead goes for a tone landing somewhere in between the mundane and the fantastic. The visual style reminds me most of Skyrim's philosophy of epic reality. Like the protagonist Yarny, the story of Unravel is similarly small in scale. You aren't trying to stop the Locust from taking over the planet, or attempting to keep the galaxy from being harvested by the Reapers. You're just trying to help an old woman with Alzheimer's stitch together the memories of her life so that she can learn to move on. The arousing score carries you on your trek through the dazzling scenery of Umeå, Sweden, on a pint-sized journey of loss, grief, and perseverance. If you listen to the creator talk for any length of time, you'll understand why this game is all heart. And that's something that can rarely be said about any commercial product. Number 23. Star Wars Republic Commando. I have played a lot, and I mean a lot, of first-person shooters in my time, especially military shooters. As a kid, I played every World War II game I could get my hands on. Medal of Honor, Call of Duty, Wolfenstein. I also grew up with Halo and played Time Splitters, Red Faction, and Nightfire whenever I could go over to my friend's house. Then as a teenager, when the market shifted, I started playing the modern combat games. Call of Duty again, Tom Clancy's, Battlefield, Delta Force, Homefront, then branched out into BioShock, Borderlands, Crysis, Payday, The Darkness, Fear, Syndicate. I mean, we could be here for a while. Like a lot of my generation growing up in the early aughts, I lived and breathed this stuff for most of my youth. So when I say that Republic Commando is my second favorite FPS game, I'd say that my word is worth something. In Republic Commando, you play as the leader of Delta, a squad of 4 commandos that are the best of the best. Bred from birth and trained every second of their lives to be killing machines. That's not what makes them memorable, though. You, along with each of your brothers, is distinctive from one another, not just in their combat specialities, but their mannerisms and personalities. They're all individuals with differing values, traits, and senses of humor. They're not just clones of the same person, indistinguishable from one another. They're people. They're men. What made this so groundbreaking is that this game came out in 2005, 2 years before Clone Wars 2007. If you hadn't read any of the novels or comics from the 3 years prior, this would be your first exposure to clones that weren't homogenous, order-following slaves that only differed from droids in their anatomy, which is what we saw of them in the films and shows. This game does an exceptional job of endearing your squad to you in such a short runtime, making you love them for their strengths as well as their quirks, and does so without pausing the action for long cutscenes or dialogue. This all serves to make the Mozambique of gut-punching reveals in the final moments of the game hit all that much harder. But speaking of action, this is a tactical squad-based shooter. Not only do you need to be a skillful FPS player in your own right, but command your team effectively at the same time. The squad is your weapon, and you won't be getting very far without them. While not as hardcore as some other tactical shooters, if you try and run around like this is a Battlefront game, you're gonna get dead real quick. And to help facilitate this, I recommend you play this game on hard, even if it's your first playthrough, as Republic Commando has one of the most well-balanced hard difficulties I've ever seen. This is a gritty, gory, boots-on-the-ground look at the most brutal era of Star Wars, and to this day I haven't encountered anything else like it, in this mythos or elsewhere. Number 22. What Remains of Edith Finch? What Remains of Edith Finch is a walking simulator, and as such is a difficult game to talk about without giving at least a brief overview of its story, so if you wish to play it completely blind, feel free to skip to the next entry. You play as Edith, a 17-year-old girl and narrator of the story, returning to her childhood home. This is a mansion of considerable size, which was clearly not enough for her family, since various outcroppings in the form of spare rooms have been added to it over the years, resulting in a monolithic structure that towers high above. As you approach, you see how hastily and irresponsibly it was built. The walls, roofs, and struts are old and dilapidated, and the architecture seems physically impossible. Like a modern art sculpture, it looks to be defying gravity, yet prepared to collapse at any moment. If you were to merely be looking at a picture of it, you would assume that it was a toy or scale model that a student made, because there's no way such a building could exist in real life. It reminds me of Howl's Moving Castle in a way, a construction that defies all logic in its sheer surreality. You return to the house because your mother left it to you in her will, along with a key that she neglected to tell you the use of. Despite her apprehension, Edith enters the house and starts to explore. You quickly find the reason the family needed to keep building onto the house. It and the Finch family living in it had been around for a long time, and whenever a family member died, they kept their room exactly as it was in memory of them. When Edith was 4, all the bedrooms were sealed off by her mother, but her great-grandmother Edie, for whom Edith is named, drilled peepholes in them so that you could still see inside. This is how Edith grew up, looking into these rooms and wondering what secrets they held. The key unlocks the first of these rooms, and from there we start learning about Edith's vast family tree. As we discover each family member's room, we investigate their belongings, and with the context of stories learned from Edith's mother and great-grandmother, learn who they are, what they were like, and eventually how they died. Each story is deeply personal, as we play the lives of Edith's family members through their own eyes. As we ascend to the house and fill in more of our family tree, we get an understanding of the Finch family as a whole, and certain similarities begin to crop up. To state the obvious, this is a story about death and how different people deal with grief. But it's also a story about the follies of human pattern recognition, confirmation bias, and how, like the Buddhist myth of the tulpa, sometimes the mere belief in a monster is enough to make it all too real. Like our previous entry, this game is quite short, but still manages to be one of the most affecting narratives in gaming, and if nothing else, Lewis's story alone is worth the price of admission. Number 21. Rule of Rose. Rule of Rose was a very obscure survival horror game until recent years. Given that it arrived in the West in late 2006, a mere 2 months before the release of the PS3, and its contemporary critical reception was quite poor, Rule of Rose sold dreadfully. This in turn means that even if you aren't familiar with the game itself, you may have heard the name due to its status as the runner-up to the most expensive PS2 game on the second-hand market, where it's currently valued at a staggering $700 as of the writing of this video. Of course, the game's rarity makes up only half of its substantial infamy, since perhaps you've heard of Rule of Rose due to it causing a bout of hysterical moral panic in Europe, where it was eventually banned in several countries, all of which was, of course, for material that wasn't actually in the game. While the content in the game is harrowing, this was yet another smear campaign by inane, terrified infants masquerading as functioning adults. I mentioned earlier that Rule of Rose was also near universally reviled by critics, earning a 59 on Metacritic, which is game review parlance for a 1.8 out of 10. This was due almost entirely to the combat, which critics found to be, dysfunctional. While I plan to make a video on this topic at some point, I couldn't disagree more. That said, the real star of the show is the narrative. Jennifer, a 19-year-old in 1930s England, is on a bus ride to the orphanage where she grew up. She lives here with several other children and 2 caretakers. The other girls have formed a club called the Red Crayon Aristocrats, and Jennifer is forced to join the club as part of the lower class, consisting of her and another girl named Amanda. Every level of the game takes place over a month, and each month we are tasked with finding a gift for the aristocracy. To help us achieve this goal, we find and befriend a dog called Brown, who remains our faithful companion through the rest of the game, and can sniff out items, secrets, and gifts for us to bring to the girls in the refined class. I don't wish to spoil too much, as this is a game that I think every horror fan should play. Suffice it to say, Rule of Rose has a singular focus on psychological horror, as each discovery leads us to a greater understanding of the social dynamics at play between the orphanage residents, showing us on a disturbingly contemplative view of humanity's darkest impulses through the children's innocent eyes. I've long been of the belief that people are neither good nor evil, but amoral. At birth, we conform to psychological egoism, only seeking to slake our lust for survival and reproduction through any means necessary. What tempers this is our socialization. We learn to play nice and get along, at first through fear of reprisal or parental punishment, but then at some point we realize that if we are to take part in society and benefit from it, we must conduct ourselves with some propriety and do as the Romans do. Or perhaps I've got it all wrong. Maybe we're born good, but the expectations of our society set up incentive structures that force us into either conformity or rebellion based on what we perceive to be fit for our environment during our youth, then informed by our personality, socioeconomic status, place and religion of birth, as well as the memes our guardians pass on to us. If such arguments are of interest to you as well, I'd urge you to give Rule of Rose a play. And do please emulate, because I'm not letting you borrow my copy. If you're still unconvinced, Rule of Rose is often referred to as the true Silent Hill 5 by its fans, and frankly I can't think of any higher praise than that. Number 20. SOMA. It would be very easy to look at SOMA and see just another stalker horror game by the devs that brought you Amnesia. Though you wouldn't be entirely wrong with that assumption insofar as the gameplay is concerned, the more forthright horror that you'd typically see in a title from Frictional Games is quite downplayed here. Indeed, the game spends just as much, if not more time, being a straightforward walking simulator than a run and hide from the spooky monster game, and even provides an option to disable enemies entirely if you so choose. SOMA likes to retain a bit more mystique than your Outlasts and your, well, Amnesias, which is likely one of the larger contributing factors in its relative obscurity. It offers comparatively little in the way of jump scares for Let's Players to overreact to, instead focusing on the atmosphere and the slow burn of the narrative, which is where the game truly shines. You are Simon Jarrett, a man left with permanent brain damage, recurring nightmares, and cerebral edema that's slowly killing him after a car accident that took the life of his friend. Simon has agreed to be the test subject of soon-to-be Dr. Munchi to help him with his thesis on neuroplasticity, which will hopefully one day lead to a viable treatment for people like you. You sit down for Munchi to do a scan of your brain, but during the scan you black out unexpectedly and wake up somewhere completely different. Munchi is gone. In fact, you are completely on your own, in an unfamiliar facility. As you explore, you learn that you're in an underwater research station at the bottom of the North Atlantic called Pathos 2, where humanity's best and brightest work together to create new technology. You're soon able to make contact with one of the doctors on the station, Catherine Shan, and once you meet up with her, the two of you work together to uncover how Simon got here, what went wrong with the station, and attempt to see Catherine's final project through to completion. SOMA's themes lay squarely on the existential, but from a viewpoint that few other games wish to tackle. As the name would suggest, SOMA wants to question what makes us real. Is it our physicality, our corporeal selves that exist in space, or maybe our minds, the unique lenses through which we perceive the world? Perhaps it's our higher awareness, our ability to question our existence, to have these thoughts in the first place. What makes us human? Is it our souls? what is a soul? Is it our consciousness? And what if that consciousness could be replicated or moved? Where would our soul go? Also, why does any of this bullshit matter? Well, just in my lifetime, we've already been able to simulate a modicum of what we would call sentience. Plus, as the science improves, we'll no doubt seek to replace our feeble mortal meat sacks with technology. And I'm not just talking about pacemakers and Google Glass. I mean that we're not that far off from full-on transhumanism, lopping off an arm for a superior bionic version. SOMA doesn't just care to reckon with these questions. It's not satisfied until it's taken a sledgehammer to the very idea of human exceptionalism, and I love it for that. While you can find more in-depth and frankly better explorations of these themes in other mediums, SOMA takes advantage of its unique standing as an interactive art piece, giving you choices, some obvious, some not so, that allow you to commune with it and test yourself against it. Plus, its use of a protagonist that is well out of his depth helps to facilitate these conversations between the game and the player. That said, SOMA's not for everyone, and you'll get out what you put in. Just something to keep in mind. Number 19. Metal Gear Solid 3 Snake Eater / Subsistence. Even though MGS3 has since been supplanted a few times over as my favorite game in the series, it was the first Metal Gear I played, and as such it holds a special place in my heart. In a series that was beginning to get a bit formulaic, especially in the settings and structures of the previous Metal Gears, Snake Eater beautifully contrasts, in particular, the sterile and metallic environments of MGS2 with a lush jungle teeming with life, one that you'll get to know intimately over the course of the game. As usual, your mission necessitates complete deniability, and equipment is OSP, but this is no longer the technology-inundated 2000s with nanomachines to keep you alive. If you want to survive, not only do you need to find your own weaponry, but bandage your own wounds and hunt your own food. Snake Eater's addition of survival mechanics to the series allows you to lose yourself in the setting of Tselinoyarsk. At the beginning of the game, you're a fish out of water, an intruder in a hostile, unfamiliar land. But by the end of your pilgrimage, you'll have adapted to the scene, and mastered the landscape to such a degree that you're a resident. Just another snake crawling around in the jungle. This unparalleled level of immersion also helps to prop up some of the most advanced stealth systems and emergent gameplay in the entire series, that in many ways were never topped, even by later entries. MGS3 is also known for having some of the best boss fights in all of gaming, and its reputation is well earned. Each fight has a different feel to it, with different methods needed to dispatch each foe, but on top of that, this is the first Metal Gear that encourages non-lethal play, and every boss can be defeated without killing them, which not only nets you a powerful camo for doing so, but drastically changes up the dynamics of most fights, and gives the game an even greater level of replayability. Snake Eater for me is the peak of the series as far as gameplay is concerned, and it's the Metal Gear that most focuses on stealth as its primary refrain. It would also fully usher in the era of cinematic Metal Gear, with cutscenes that leaned into the absurdist tone that had only occasionally reared its head in the previous entries. The technology was finally at a level where Kojima could show off his flair for the dramatic with hardly any limitations, which gave MGS3 a level of bombast that, save for one other entry, the rest of the series never quite matched. This resonated perfectly with the 1960s spy thriller narrative that combines an equal amount of electrifying action with a poignant story that puts you through the emotional ringer. Snake Eater's narrative, though it isn't as ambitious as some other entries, and didn't fully vibe with me at the time given that I both wasn't used to Kojima's writing style and lacked the context of the rest of the series, has only grown stronger with time, and even though it's far from my favorite Metal Gear plot, it still blows the vast majority of other game stories out of the water. As an overall package, MGS3 is one of the finest experiences that you can have in the medium. It's no wonder that it remains the most universally beloved entry in one of gaming's most storied and lauded franchises. Please note that you should play the Subsistence release if you plan on playing the game for the first time, and for the love of God, don't buy the Master Collection, just emulate it. Number 18. Halo Reach. Reach is a game I could talk about for a long time, and I plan to, so how do I convince you to play it in only a few minutes? Well, Halo, no, I'm not going to call it by its dumbass subtitle, was the first game I ever played, and Halo 2 was the first game I ever beat. I've played these 5 campaigns countless times over the years, and while 2 holds a special place in my heart, Reach is the one that's really stuck with me. Not only does Reach have the most massive combat sandbox of any Halo game, but a combination of levels and settings that take advantage of all of it, providing a varied experience that always stays fresh, even putting you in actual ship-to-ship combat for the first time in the series. Even with the lack of the Flood, the encounters are crafted in a way that keeps the smaller number of enemy types from getting stale. Plus, you finally get to team up with other Spartans. And I mean actual Spartans, not just your little brother that you're using as a mobile spawn point so that you can beat Legendary through pure attrition. Noble Team is an effective combat force, and you can feel their absence in the levels where they aren't around to watch your back. But none of that is what makes Reach unique. Aside from Earth itself, the planet Reach is the largest concentration of military force that humanity has, with a fleet of UNSC ships and dozens of Spartans on station at any time, given that this is their training ground. As we're driven to meet our new squad, we take in the extraordinary beauty of the planet, and upon arrival, our new commander, Carter, gives us the lowdown on who we are. Noble 6, a Spartan 3 with more of our files censored than legible. We're a lone wolf who's taken out entire insurrectionist groups by ourselves. Our old commanding officer used us as his personal Grim Reaper, and we're marked as ultra-lethal, a classification given to only one other Spartan. You are a 100% certified badass, just like Master Chief, and not only that, but you have 5 other badasses backing you up. You're the strongest you've ever been at any point in the series, and in those first few levels, you feel like it too, as you bulldoze any Covenant unlucky enough to get in your way. During these first few missions, Reach also does a stellar job of characterizing each of your squad mates, from in-your-face aspects like the brief yet elusive cutscene dialogue, all the way down to their armor, mannerisms, idle chatter, and body language. You start to really get to know these people, and in turn, as they see how reliable you are, they start putting their trust in you. Finally, you and the Covenant throw your full weight against each other. You kill hundreds of them, taking out AA guns as you tear your way through the mountainside. Then you ascend a Covenant spire, murk everyone inside, and prepare it for orbital bombardment. After taking a flying leap onto a waiting chopper, you watch the tower crumble, and George lets out an uncharacteristic nod of satisfaction, while you barely even register the purple glow beginning to emanate from above.
No, somebody tell me this ain't happening.
UNSC frigate Grafton, do you copy?
Grafton is dust. We need to get out of here now.
You don't know it yet, but this is the beginning of the end. You'll fight long and hard for Reach, until you've given every last part of yourself to her. You'll try to save as many people as you can, you'll carve a swath through the Covenant armada, but in the end, you'll lose. This game that did so well to make you feel powerful just a few levels prior, will spend the rest of its time beating you into the dirt. The Halo trilogy wanted to make you feel like a badass who saves the galaxy, like an unstoppable messiah defending humanity against all odds. ODST flipped that on its head and made you feel weak and alone, but it was still a hopeful story in the end. Reach has no such concerns. It wants to take you at the height of your glory and bring you low. It's a tragedy, a train wreck that you can't help but watch, and there's no other game like it. I can't think of a better way this saga could have ended. Yep, ended. No other Halo games were made after 2010, so don't bother looking.
Roger that. Bring a strike team.
I need covering fire! In position.
Spartans, hostiles north.
Forklift simulator.
Number 17. Metal Gear Solid 4: Guns of the Patriots. MGS4 is probably the strangest entry in the entire series, and that's saying something. It's a game that I can't talk about without spoiling it, so if you haven't played it, please skip to the timestamp on screen. That's because this game is unequivocally made specifically for Metal Gear superfans. It reminds me a lot of the Evangelion Rebuild movies in that its story is extremely metatextual, and yet it went far over the heads of its target audience. Or perhaps it would be better to reference something that my audience will be more familiar with, like, say, Dark Souls 3. Is this a powerful, deeply personal meta-narrative on when to let dreams die, and what it looks like when a work of fiction is necromanced back to life by its creator who only wants it to die and stay dead? It is once again forced to reanimate it one last time by his bosses, co-workers, and death threats from his so-called fans. Is this the inevitability of attempting to tie up every last thread in a series that contradicts and retcons itself on a biblical level? Or is this what every series must become when it's gone past its natural expiry date, and the only thing left is an apparition parading around a sad simulacrum of a once-adored character, or game, or franchise, doomed to relive or invert the past once more? Or is it just a piece of shit that Kojima threw together with as much self-referential tripe as possible to try and get that nostalgia juice pumping, and maybe achieve a somewhat satisfying end as long as everyone was even more sedated than the PMC's soldiers and would passively accept it? I'll never know, but goddamn did I enjoy it. Is MGS2, or even MGS1 for that matter, in VR? Did the mammal pod truly and accurately simulate the boss's will? Did Kojima hate Metal Gear, Konami, Koji Pro, the fans, and most of all himself while making MGS4 as his final cry for help? Was Shepard indoctrinated? No, wait, wrong series. These are the kinds of questions that make Metal Gear interesting, unique, and, above all, timeless. So I could never say that I don't like this game's story, because even if the Patriots are the happy-go-lucky codec crew from Snake Eater, even if Ocelot knows where Snake is at all times and shows up randomly just to do finger guns, even if Snake picks up 2 AKs that are supposed to be ID tagged at the start of the game, even if the liquid arm never actually went anywhere and it was hypnotherapy or whatever the entire time, even if the lollylulelo Patriots plot thread has so little consistency it could be considered gaslighting, and even if Ocelot, of all people, turns out to somehow be the good guy, and we end the series with one of the most tasteless inserts of Here's to You I've ever seen, that's all just part of the insanity of Metal Gear, and I wouldn't trade it for anything. Not to mention that, aside from the overarching story, this game hits its themes of sense, dehumanization, normalization of violence, and the military-industrial excuse me, the war economy on the head, and in that way, was a perfect sequel to MGS 1 and 2. MGS4 is dumb and weird and messy and makes no sense, and the level design can't decide whether it wants to be torturous or the peak of the series. It wants to celebrate the series' legacy, while at the same time trying its best to kill the franchise so completely that no one would ever touch it again. It's all of Kojima's feelings about his child that he no longer recognizes, put into a video game. It's the most schizophrenic game I've ever played, and, well, I love it. Number 16. Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic. Those who know me are probably surprised to see KOTOR 1 this low on the list, and frankly that may be due at this point to sheer acquaintance. For those who don't know me, a bit of explanation is in order. I have played through KOTOR 1 over 50 times. I've done just about every choice imaginable, and played with every build I can think of. I spent over 1,000 hours and a full year of my life constructing my own remaster of the game, which, trust me, is a hell of a lot better than whatever Saber Interactive plans to shit out. If said project is even still in development, you know, this week. This is the only game I think I could legitimately play blindfolded. And you know what? I'm still not tired of it. So you ask, what makes KOTOR a one-of-a-kind game? When BioWare was tasked with this project, they were given 2 options. They could either make a tie-in game based around Attack of the Clones, or they could make a game set 4,000 years before A New Hope. And I say this as a staunch AOTC defender, thank God they went with the latter. KOTOR's setting meant that the plot didn't have to focus on the family soap opera of the Skywalkers, and instead could do pretty much whatever it wanted. It was a chance to see Star Wars like we had never seen it outside of the books and comics. The themes and aesthetics are still reminiscent of the films, giving it a familiar feeling, while at the same time not needing to rely on any pre-established material. This allowed KOTOR to carve out its own place in the Star Wars mythos, while at the same time opening up fans of the films to just how large the Star Wars universe could truly be. It is a time of civil war. The Sith are no longer just a master and apprentice conniving in the shadows, but a vast empire that is waging an open conflict against the Republic and the Jedi Order. You see, this was before Darth Bane implemented the Rule of Two, which was largely in response to
1 hour later.
Therein, the Rule of Two helped to stymie the Ouroboros nature of the Sith, which had previously led to various cycles of apogee, collapse, near extinction, and reformation, which is a cycle that is once again borne out in KOTOR 1. What was this in service of? Oh, yeah, there are a lot of Sith around in KOTOR 1, and we opened during the height of the Jedi Civil War, which the Sith are handedly winning. You are a modest foot soldier stationed on the Endar Spire, a Republic cruiser that has been ambushed by a Sith battle fleet. As you're woken from your slumber by alarms and laser fire, you and a fellow crew member have to make a beeline for the escape pods before the Endar Spire is atomized. After barely escaping with your life, you crash land on the planet below. This was no random attack, however, but a calculated strike. The Endar Spire was transporting a young Jedi, Bastila. Despite only being a Padawan, Bastila has a rare power that is crucial to the Republic's war effort. Luckily, the only other survivor of the Endar Spire was a crack pilot, and something of a war hero. When you were knocked unconscious in the crash, he dragged your sorry self to safety. Upon waking up, you realize your only choice is to work together to find Bastila, if she's still alive, and then concoct some way to escape the planet, which the Sith have since put under martial law. From these humble beginnings, you embark on a galaxy-spanning adventure to build an eclectic band of allies, quell the Sith's unbridled onslaught, and become who you were truly meant to be. For me, KOTOR's greatest contribution to the Star Wars mythos is its focus on fleshing out the philosophies of the Jedi and Sith. For their importance, the two central dogmas around which Star Wars is based are given little explanation in the films aside from light side good, dark side bad. Or at least that's what the average layman would tell you, when actually
2 hours later.
So the light and dark sides are largely a dialectical spectrum that exists between the two poles of the robot and the beast, and somewhere in between is where you find your humanity, which is why the only two good examples of apotheosis that we see in the movies are actually not Yoda or Obi-Wan, who are utter failures, but crucially, Luke and Qui-Gon. Qui-Gon has to become a renegade and rebel against the Jedi Council, who have lost their way because they no longer serve the Force, they serve the corrupt Senate, which gives him the perspective to be able to find the Chosen One in the first place because he follows its instincts versus the Council, who have become so political and dispassionate that they can't even feel the will of the Force anymore, regardless of Sidious's influence. And Luke has to become a Jedi like his father before him. Those are the two opposing halves of his destiny converging into a synthesis which allows him to believe that his father's love for him can permit him to overcome his fear, hatred, and pain. And it's this sacrificial nature, this time manifesting itself as pure agape love rather than as martyrdom like an empire, that shows Vader the error of his ways and forces him to repent. What led to this tirade? Oh, we were talking about KOTOR. Due to its contributions to the lore of the universe, KOTOR has become a bedrock for all the Star Wars to come after it, and something of a Rosetta Stone for appreciating the deeper themes of the franchise, which in many ways makes it the quintessential Star Wars story, and something every fan of the franchise owes it to themselves to experience. So with that said, go buy it on GOG, don't support Aspire or I'll perform the Black Sacrament, download Universal Widescreen, install the community patch, buy a future pilot, and copy these settings. Trust me, they're important. And then, go to town, Charlie Brown. Number 15. Katawa Shoujo, or Disability Girls. Katawa Shoujo is a visual novel about a high schooler who, upon being confessed to by his crush, experiences a heart attack caused by dormant arrhythmia, and after several months in the hospital was finally released, but as he needs fairly constant supervision, can no longer attend his old school. From then on, he's forced to go to a special school for the physically impaired. From here, the game plays out as something of a mix between a romance and a character drama, as you get to know the other students at the school and try to put your life back together. Considering that this was technically an eroge game about dating disabled girls, and oh yeah, it was made mostly by 4chan board members, you can see how quickly this project could have gone off the rails. Amazingly, after a massive number of revolving staff and 5 years of development hell, it actually released, entirely for free, and it wasn't a shit show. Quite the opposite, actually. It handles its portrayal of disabilities with tact and care, while also managing to craft a story for each route that focuses on every character as a unique person who's just trying to live their lives, rather than someone defined by their handicap. This story was especially meaningful for me. I very rarely identify with characters in fiction, and I don't consider it anything of a prerequisite to enjoying a story. In fact, I'm often annoyed by stories that seem to do little more than pander to a certain demographic, with little of substance to prop up the narrative and themes. For maybe one of the first times in my life, though, I got it. Hey guys, editing aggroed here. Before I say what I'm about to, I'd like to make one thing perfectly explicit. I'm telling you this information in order to give you context for why this game meant so much to me, and why I was able to identify with its characters and themes. I'm not telling you this in an attempt to garner sympathy or to have a pity party. That victimhood mindset is something that I had to work long and hard to shed, and it's become a part of myself and humanity that I absolutely abhor. So with that in mind, on with the video. When I was 7, I was in a really bad bike crash. My body took a few weeks to recover, but what I didn't realize at the time was the damage that my mind had sustained. For the next 18 years, I would get headaches with increasing frequency and severity. After playing American football in junior high and having a couple of unrelated accidents, the concussions started piling up, and it wasn't long before I had debilitating migraines every second of every day. It made it near impossible to do anything. Just trying to eat and sleep was about all I could manage. When I couldn't fall asleep, I'd play games to distract me from the pain, at least when my parents would let me. My chronic absences got to the point where I was kicked out of school for poor attendance during my sophomore year, and even the special school where I only had to attend twice a week became too much after a while. Sometimes the pain got so bad that I considered pulling the plug, and on a few instances I would have if I physically could have. I remember going to just about every doctor in the state during those years, trying every new experimental treatment that either made me worse or had no effect. I could hardly get out of bed in the morning, so I was pretty much a certified NEET for almost 5 years. Then when I was 22, I played Katawa Shoujo, and I saw so many of the feelings that I couldn't get out of my head reflected back at me. The self-pity, apathy, anger, depression, self-hatred, and hopelessness. But I saw another side to it as well. These people, many of whom had it a lot worse than me, were still trying their best every day, still trying to live the life that they wanted to live, despite the fear and hardship. This game reminded me that, to steal a line, home is something you build, and I needed to get started. I've been through a lot of pain since then, along with other health issues that were just as incapacitating, but my headaches have improved over the years, and they've become manageable. Now this last year or so, for the first time in, 2 decades, I don't feel stuck anymore. I feel like I have a path forward, a future worth chasing. More every day, I realize I'm a lot tougher than I thought, and I've still got a lot more fight in me than I thought. And in a lot of ways, that all started with Katawa Shoujo. Number 14. Aze de Panzerdragoon RPG, or Panzerdragoon Saga. Series creator Yukio Futatsugi wasn't satisfied with just making a great series of rail shooters. Even in the first Panzerdragoon, there were hints of a larger world at play, and a story that could only be told through a vastly expanded scope. So while part of his team worked on a follow-up to the original, the other half set to work on Aze de Panzerdragoon RPG. Team Andromeda had the talent required to get the absolute most out of the Saturn's hardware, which was no mean feat. The Saturn was meant to be the ultimate 2D powerhouse, with little thought given to how it would render polygons. And when Sega was concerned by the specs of the soon-to-be-released PlayStation, they added a second CPU to the Saturn at the last minute, with no one actually knowing how to utilize it properly. This made the Saturn legendarily difficult to program for. So how, pray tell, was a team supposed to make a fully 3D JRPG on a console not designed for 3D, on weaker hardware than the PlayStation, and said game was going to be marketed as Sega's response to Final Fantasy VII? Well, they couldn't, but they sure gave it one hell of an attempt. Saga's graphics rival, if not surpass, that of its Sony counterpart. The aesthetic post-apocalyptic wastes of a once-thriving world now dominated by biomechanical terrors creates a feeling of macabre dread, only temporarily assuaged by returning to your campfire or town. This tone is enhanced by the uniquely understated color palette of the Saturn, and then punctuated with a punchy OST that augments each mood of heart-pounding tension, somber melancholy, and beguiling mystique. Saga's gameplay, however, and I don't say this lightly, is its greatest accomplishment. The combat system was one of the last aspects that was settled on, and was actually overhauled fairly late in development, but you wouldn't be able to tell. The basic setup is somewhat similar to Final Fantasy's active time battle system, where you and each enemy have a timer governing the amount of delay between each action you can take. However, this is then augmented by your being on a dragon. You can occupy and fly between 4 different quadrants around an enemy. This is necessary to dodge attacks as well as to get a vantage point on enemy weak spots. But the ATB meter stops building as you fly between quadrants, meaning that you have to be economical with your movements. Furthermore, you can use a turn to morph your dragon between forms that give you more attack power but less special power and vice versa, and whether you have a faster ATB meter or more defensive strength and vice versa, or any combination thereof. This essentially allows you to change your build whenever you please to better deal with the specific enemy that you're fighting. You have 2 basic attacks, the dragon's lasers and your pistol, which are used for attacking a lot of enemies or a single point respectively. But on top of that, you have the dragon's special attacks, which are powerful but use up multiple actions. Plus, aside from accounting for specific enemy resistances, you also have to factor in your position and attack with regards to their physicality, since your special attacks will flat out miss if you use one that doesn't actually hit an enemy in physical space. On top of all that, how well you do in a fight, which determines the money and XP you get at the end, isn't just graded on whether you defeat an enemy or not, but how much damage you take, how little you fly, and how quickly you do it. This essentially means that every new enemy is like a puzzle that you have to figure out how to fight effectively, and every fight is dripping with intensity as you try to find the most efficient way to dispatch a foe. This is, without exaggeration, my favorite gameplay loop in any RPG, maybe even any game I've ever played. Now, I focused a lot on the combat system here, and it's worth experiencing the game just for that. But every other aspect, from the story to the aesthetics, graphics, soundtrack, balancing, pacing, as well as the sheer ambition, make Panzerdragoon Saga one of the finest RPGs of the 5th generation, and a game that everyone should find a way to play. Number 13. Dragon Age Origins Ultimate Edition. Dragon Age Origins is just Knights of the Old Republic 1, but better in every way. Number 12. Okay, I guess there's more to say than that, but that really is my impression of it after all these years. KOTOR served as something of a prototype for Dragon Age in many ways. DAO takes the combat system of KOTOR that was a solid foundation, but felt lacking in many areas, and ramps it up several notches, adding a fourth party member slot, environmental considerations, elemental weaknesses, traps, stuns, more meaningful skills, more tactical options, more build possibilities, plus a ton more encounter variety. It also makes you use every tool at your disposal. Unlike KOTOR, which for my taste is far too easy even on the hardest difficulty, you can't just button mash your way through combat. In comparison to KOTOR, which I beat as an 8-year-old, Origins kicked the crap out of me as a teen, and I ended up putting it down because of that. But to counter that difficulty, you're given the tools to properly micromanage your party, and constantly make an array of split-second decisions that keep the combat interesting. Origins fully delivers on the unique proposal of real-time tactics combat that KOTOR simply didn't have the depth to provide. Playing this game on Nightmare difficulty is, to this day, one of my top 3 gameplay loops, and it never ceases to keep me engaged. I should be clear, I don't say this to dunk on KOTOR's combat. I generally enjoy it, especially now that I understand it far more than I did as a kid. But Origins took a serviceable combat system and made it fantastic. This is on top of having a much more well-rounded cast of characters. While some of KOTOR's companions are hit or miss, and at least one of them is outright bad, it's hard to think of a single weak character of Origins' cast. Your dialogue options are also far more fleshed out, and allow you to roleplay many types of characters, in comparison to KOTOR's purposefully binary and juvenile conversation choices for your player character, which helps to make the morality of the world more satisfyingly complex. The added influence system for your companions also does a lot to make them feel more like real people, rather than NPCs dispensing dialogue. The efficient world building effortlessly draws you into the dark fantasy setting, while managing to refrain from heavy-handedness and keep the ball rolling. All of this without needing to rely on pre-established lore from an expanded universe. And yes, I said dark fantasy, not Guardians of the Galaxy meets Clash of Clans. One of Dragon Age Origins' best aspects for me is its namesake. When you start a new game, you're given a choice of race and background. From there you play through one of 6 introductory sequences that serve as the inciting incident of the game before converging back onto the main story. While they vary in length and quality, the ability to have some meaningful decision regarding your player character's backstory in a Western RPG is a refreshing change of pace, and ensures that you'll never feel bad about starting a new playthrough. Frankly, it's an element of DAO that I wish more games saw fit to just straight up copy. Even after soon-to-be 3 other releases in the series, Origins remains the best Dragon Age by a long shot, and that's definitely not going to change anytime soon. This was BioWare firing on all cylinders, and a game that every Western RPG fan should play, even if they have no intention to check out the rest of the series. Plus, if you wanted to try out something like KOTOR but you don't much care for Star Wars, maybe give Origins a go. This is the only game that I've ever finished and then immediately played it all the way through a second time, and if that doesn't convince you of its greatness, I'm not sure what will. Well gamers, we're at the halfway point, and let me just say, we're really getting into the heavy hitters now. There's a distinctive jump in quality in the second half of the list compared to the first. These are all games that I consider to be more or less perfect, and most of the time choosing between them is a matter of splitting hairs. So if anything is lower or higher than you think it should be, please know that it was just as agonizing for me to pick between them. Number 12. Celeste. Celeste is everything I've ever wanted out of a platformer, which is why it's so irksome that it remains part of a fairly niche subgenre of what I would call pure platformers. Games that don't have combat or enemies that you have to fight in the traditional sense, but platformers that are principally focused on giving you a difficult precision challenge that you have to overcome through movement alone. Most of the time nowadays, games like this are eschewed, even by indie devs, in favor of rage games that they hope will get picked up by a popular streamer. And I know you get my meaning when I say rage games. However, there are, to me, only 3 chief differences between rage games and precision platformers. First is the punishment for failure. Upon death, rage games will punish you as much as realistically possible for your mistake. This is a way to artificially extend playtime and nothing else. It does not add difficulty, only the illusion of it. Of course, NES games in particular were infamous for this. Second, the precision of the movement. Rage games will often have controls that are finicky or just straight up RNG. This is again the illusion of difficulty. If the controls of a game are nearly, if not totally impossible to master, the only thing that makes it hard is the sheer amount of time and patience it takes to finish the game. Finally, rage games are filled with first-time player traps. These are deaths that are unavoidable unless you've played the game before and know how to not die to them already. Any of these mechanics alone create a frustrating experience, but two, or God help you, all three, and you have crafted true hell. Celeste obviously doesn't do any of this. Your punishment for dying is restarting a screen. There's no checkpoints, no life counter, and each screen is typically no longer than 10 seconds to complete. And you respawn near instantaneously instead of having to go to a loading screen or watch a long death animation. The controls are also extremely clean. You always jump or dash the same distance without having to hold the button down, which I swear is one of the worst platformer mechanics ever invented, and I have to consciously stop myself from putting down any platformer that implements it. Just because Mario did it doesn't mean it should be in every damn game. Hell, it doesn't even mean it was a good idea. If I see one more... Okay, I'll save that rant for another time, but trust me, it's coming. Alright, where was I? The controls are amazing, and there isn't a single first-time player trap in sight. It also has pitch-perfect pacing, introducing new mechanics at a steady pace and then twisting and combining them into all kinds of crazy input strings. All of this means that Celeste can have some of the most precise platforming challenges in gaming, and at no point does it ever become frustrating or feel insurmountable. It's just one engaging mechanical feat after another that just gets more and more satisfying the further in you get. I played this entire game 8 hours in one sitting on a school night and had to practically force myself to go get food, because I just didn't want to stop. I loved every single second of Celeste. It is unequivocally the most fun I've ever had with any platformer, maybe even any video game period. Even after all that, after you reach the summit of Celeste Mountain, you find out there's more. So much more. All berries, B-sides, C-sides, farewell, and then golden berries and moonberry if you're an actual head case. All of it more challenging than the last, until it gets to the point of near impossibility, but you just can't stop. How much farther to the berry? Give me more berries! I'm getting fairly close to completing Celeste at this point, and that's something I do very rarely, and only with the games I truly adore. If you haven't played Celeste, I'm actually begging you, go see just how great a platformer can be. I guarantee you won't regret it. Oh, also the story's good. Number 11. Catherine Full Body. Catherine received some amount of notoriety upon release for its content and themes that, like Rule of Rose, were laughably overblown, but has since mostly faded into obscurity aside from a small boost to its popularity after the reminder of its existence upon the release of Full Body, a remastered expansion of the original in 2019. This was Atlus's first game on the PS3, and was originally pitched as a small side project to help acquaint the team with the PS3's tricky hardware before they started work on a new Persona game, which would of course result in the continuing of Atlus's penchant of releasing amazing games on consoles long after they had already been succeeded by the next generation. But I digress. Catherine is a puzzle game about moving around blocks to climb a tower. A simple description for a game that's anything but. These towers are found in our main character's nightmares, and as the game goes on, you'll have a plethora of new block types to contend with. On top of that, you're obstructed or assaulted by other climbers, there's a ticking clock that makes the tower fall out from underneath you, and that's before encountering the bosses that you need to avoid the attacks of while climbing. These towers rapidly increase in complexity and difficulty, which ensures you're always being thoroughly challenged, especially on the higher difficulties, to the point where Catherine makes most FromSoft games look easy by comparison. Basically what I'm saying is that when you play Catherine, the ticket pays for the whole CPU, you only need the If not for perhaps Chapter 9 of Celeste, this is the hardest game I've ever completed, and last I heard, the completionist himself would agree. But even the greatest gameplay in the world typically isn't enough to make me love a game by itself. It also needs to have a compelling narrative, and more than anything, that's where Catherine really delivers. Catherine is about Vincent, a man in his early 30s who's in a stagnant long-term relationship with a girl named Catherine with a K. While Catherine wants to push the relationship forward, get married, have kids, white picket fence, all that, Vincent is having a difficult time coming to grips with the changing circumstances of their relationship. He's a go-with-the-flow kind of guy, and isn't really ready for the responsibility that settling down would bring. and he might even be considering breaking up with Catherine if she continues to push the subject. He's mulling over this predicament in a bar with his buddies, and after they leave for the night, a young woman walks over and starts chatting him up. Her name is Catherine with a C. They hit it off, and after a few more drinks, he wakes up the next morning with her sleeping next to him. Over the next several nights, it's Vincent's job to decide whether he wants to try and save his relationship with Catherine with a K, break up with her and pursue Catherine with a C, or go in a different direction. All this while surviving the Nightmare Tower each night. One of Catherine's strongest aspects are the choices at the top of each tower that influence the story, with up to 13 different endings to achieve, ranging from the absurd to the truly heartwarming. Despite its initial reputation, Catherine has achieved a mature, fleshed-out depiction of relationships in all of their beauty and messiness, the likes of which I don't think has been topped in this medium, though please do give me your recommendations in the comments. Catherine is one of the weirdest games you'll ever play, and it's worth every second to see it through to the end. To quickly address this, there is a vocal sect of the community that prefers the original game to full body because the addition of the third heroine was a bit sloppy, and it partially ruins the thematic dichotomy at play in the original love triangle. However, while I think the best possible experience would be to play the original game first and then play full body like I did, that's an unrealistic expectation. If you're just now picking up Catherine for the first time, and if it wasn't clear enough, I highly recommend that you do, it's okay to just play full body. Number 10. Metal Gear Solid / Integral. I've noticed there's been a trend rising as of late from those both inside and out of the Metal Gear community that even though it was one of the most influential and important games of its era, Metal Gear Solid doesn't really hold up. This, of course, being part of the wider consensus that the 5th generation has aged poorly in comparison to the 4th and 6th. Frankly, I don't think this could be any further from the truth. The 5th gen was an era of innovation and creativity that led to enormous strides in the medium. With the jump to hardware that was created with 3D at the forefront, a literal new dimension was unlocked for game development. And with the steady increase in market size since the 3rd gen, this meant that developers now had the funding, experience, and technology to make the first and, as of yet, the only true leap in the medium's history. This was also during a time when video game budgets were kept in check, which meant that you wouldn't see the scope creep of today's AAA projects that results in broken, mediocre, overlong games that are made for everyone, and thereby for no one. Games of this era were made with a specific vision in mind. A vision that could get publishers on board because if it was executed on properly, the game would sell. Gamers hadn't yet fallen into the rut of buying Call of Duty and FIFA every year. We were excited to try new things and have fresh experiences, rather than just going back to playing our comfort genre or whatever multiplayer game we'd been addicted to for the last couple years. Too caught up in the throes of easy dopamine, FOMO, and sunk cost fallacy to ever give something a little different an honest chance. All this meant that the 5th generation became a golden age for the medium, the likes of which we haven't seen again, where varied, unique, and exciting experiences were being crafted with passion, releasing weekly, and being enjoyed with a fervor that, as of yet, I haven't seen return. And sure, with so many new ideas being floated around, some of them were bound to be bad, or poorly executed upon, but without those stepping stones, even better games would never have been created. So, no, the 5th generation hasn't aged poorly. To this day, it remains exciting, surprising, intriguing, and an overall great time for anyone that can be just a little outgoing. That's great and all, but why am I bringing this up now? Well, dear viewer, it's because Metal Gear Solid is the 5th generation. This game is bold, radical, and unapologetic about it. Despite in many ways practically being a remake of Metal Gear 2, Solid feels like a whole new beast, a truly cinematic action movie thriller. The eclectic gameplay keeps you on your toes while using every last bit of the technology's capabilities to its utmost. A fleshed out and, for the time, incredibly well-acted cast of believable characters make you grow to love and hate them as the story unfolds. The cold, callous halls of the nuclear disassembly facility are contrasted with the stunning beauty of Alaska, which is backed by a haunting hymnal soundtrack that evokes the feeling of a religious odyssey. Finally, the narrative isn't some elementary school morality lesson, but an intense altercation between free will and predeterminism, a rumination on the inherent evil of mankind and the irreparability of the human condition, and the search for meaning in a world that we're born to bereft of an essence. You can see Kojima's heart and ardor in every inch of this game. Even so, I see a lot of people nowadays who are afraid to try Metal Gear because they don't like stealth games. And to those people, I'd say, play MGS1. Metal Gear is not as much of a stealth series as one would think, given how it's talked about. Hell, the term stealth doesn't even appear in the series tagline that was coined by this game. Metal Gear, for my money, spends just as much time being a boss rush or otherwise typical action game series, and Solid truly exemplifies this. More than any other game in the series, Solid delivers on the promise of tactical espionage action, with a breakneck pace that makes you unable to put it down, and a broad diversity in gameplay and set pieces that continually presents new challenges. Even among the rest of the series, there is simply nothing else like Metal Gear Solid. And if someone is looking to dip their toe into the series, this is the game I recommend that you start with. Again, please emulate it, don't support the Master Collection. Also, if one more person asks me if they should play the original or Twin Snakes, I swear to fucking God! Number 9. Metal Gear Solid 2 Sons of Liberty / Substance. Back in the long ago of 2019, Max Durrott released a video called The Most Profound Moment in Video Game History. It was about the final codec call in Metal Gear Solid 2 Sons of Liberty, a moment that has only gotten more prescient and relevant with each passing day. It largely predicted the social zeitgeist that we find ourselves in, and detailed at length the downsides of our terminally online lifestyle, while at the same time making a compelling case for our inability to possess free will in the digital age, then providing its own chilling yet logical solution. All this in a game from 2001. While it builds upon some ideas found in other works, like Serial Experiments Lane, the interactive medium is used to make this moment ring truer than it ever could in a different art form. It's a virtuosic feat of screenwriting that I haven't seen the equal of in any other game. This moment was so powerful that after seeing it, I simply had to find out what else this writer could do. That was my introduction to Kojima's work, and that very day I started playing through the Metal Gear series, a franchise that I can now say is my favorite saga in gaming, as should be evident by it constituting a full 1/6 of this video. But if there's one thing that I want to impress upon you during this entry, it's this. Metal Gear Solid 2 is so much more than just that moment. And if you were to merely watch that moment without playing the game, you'd miss all the context leading up to it. What makes this moment so brilliant is everything surrounding it. The purposefully deceptive marketing of the game up to and including the box art, the similarities and divergences between it and its predecessor, the tonal whiplash of the characters and story, the themes that build off of the first game, the prologue sequence, the dreamlike setting, all the plot reveals and gotchas, it all works to set up the game's final rug pull that hits you in the face like a hammer. MGS2 is in a special category of games that are so impeccably well crafted that they cease to be video games at all, and instead can only be defined as interactive experiences. That said, even as just a game, without the rest of the baggage that I just put on it, MGS2 was astonishing. It's one of the largest jumps in quality I've seen in a series, and they did it with only 3 years dev time on unfamiliar hardware, and with a, for the time, relatively standard AAA budget of $10 million. Now, bodies needed to be hidden, enemies could detect shadows, lights and other environmental objects could be destroyed to reduce enemy vision or give you an advantage. An added layer of verticality to the level design drastically increases the complexity of remaining hidden. Advanced enemy AI hunts you down as a unit rather than individually. The new ability to shoot in first person does realistic damage to body parts and equipment. Boss fights are now multi-stage onslaughts that test a multitude of different skills, and ice cubes melt in real time. Yeah, that's only the tip of the iceberg. Koji Pro's mastery of hardware is undeniable. With each new Metal Gear entry, they created what would be considered the most advanced and best-looking games for years to come. And never is that more evident than with MGS2. Just to really drive it home, this is what 3 years of technological innovation used to look like. Even if I were to disregard the rest of the franchise, the 1-2 punch of MGS 1 and 2 alone would make Metal Gear my favorite series in gaming. That said, as you know, I'll go to bat for MGS 1 any day, but Sons of Liberty is the best Metal Gear by a fair margin. It was a generation-defining leap in technology. It's one of the best sequels ever made, period, not just in video games. It still has one of, if not the finest gaming narrative in a non-RPG, and it's on the shortlist for the best game of not just the decade, but of all time. A few entries back, I said that Dragon Age Origins is the only game I have ever finished, and then immediately started up a second playthrough and finished it again. That was only half true, because Sons of Liberty is the first and only game I've ever played all the way through 3 times in a row. Back to back to back. Number 8. Xenogears. I've already talked a lot about Xenogears recently in my video ranking every game I played in 2023. It was my game of the year, and thus my longest entry on the list. Given that, I frankly don't have a lot more that I can say about it so soon, especially in entries that I'm attempting to keep under 5 minutes each. So if you'd like to hear my thoughts on the game itself, go watch that video. I'll put a link in the description. Instead, I'd like to talk about the game's translator, Richard Honeywood, who is something of a personal hero of mine. At the time that Xenogears was being developed, localization was a complete afterthought. Japanese games, especially JRPGs, weren't expected to sell well in foreign countries, so localizations were done as cheaply as possible with very little auxiliary infrastructure to assist the translators, which is generally what led to what were at the time perceived to be shoddy translations. A name that probably comes to most JRPG fans' minds when I say that is Ted Woolsey, Square's lead translator from 1991 through 96, who worked on Final Fantasy VI and Chrono Trigger, among others. Both games are known for having their, to put it lightly, eccentricities in the original English script, and the same is true of Xenogears. This is not because Woolsey, Honeywood, or anyone else were bad translators, but it was due to their near-complete lack of direction and support from the main developers. What changed this was, as you would suspect, Final Fantasy VII. The success of that title showed Square and other JRPG creators that they could sell huge numbers in the West. Unfortunately, Xenogears was released only a few months later, not nearly long enough for this new perspective to have made a difference in Square's localization philosophy. Richard would later describe the translation process as pure hell. While there were originally other translators on the team, they all either quit or requested to be transferred to other projects. This was because of the game's religious elements that were deemed to be deeply problematic. Xenogears has a lot to say in the vein of religion, and it's not always kind in its portrayals of the church. However, while there is some imagery that could be misconstrued as Christian and Catholic in particular, Xenogears doesn't reference the Christian faith at all. The game is entirely focused on depictions of Gnosticism and Jewish mysticism. These are belief systems that would be entirely foreign to the West, aside from bona fide religious scholars. But they're referenced in Japanese media fairly often, and Japanese gamers would likely be familiar with a lot of their ideas. As well, the very concept of God is completely different to an Eastern audience as compared to those that grew up with tales of Abrahamic religions. Plus, Square originally naming the final boss of the game Yahweh certainly didn't help, something that Honeywood later got them to change. These elements of the game would be inevitably misconstrued by a Western audience, so to avoid backlash, every English translator left. That is, except for Richard Honeywood. This wasn't an easy decision, though. He was a deeply religious man, and his church's elders were adamant that he should leave the project. Honeywood was forced to work mostly by himself and had little communication with Square proper. Not only that, at the time, translation work had to conform to the constraints of the technology. For example, you would have to translate the same amount of information using fewer words, since Japanese gets across far more in a single character than we do in English. His encoding technology was also incredibly primitive. All by himself, he was directing, programming, and translating the most complicated script in video game history, with no one to check his work. He was working around the clock and slept in the office for months to complete the game. And as a fun piece of trivia, he even burned the master discs of the English version himself. The game was barely in a finished state by the time of release, but somehow he managed it, and that's how any of us are able to play Xenogears today. After the game was finished, Richard thought that Square would consider him a failure, but instead he gained their respect, and subsequently helped Square revamp their entire localization process by moving translators closer to the actual dev team so that they could communicate better, and by hiring full-time editors to the team, along with a bevy of other changes which can be felt in the quality of every localization since. He was also invited back to work on other high-profile Square titles like Final Fantasy XI and Chrono Cross. So, thank you, Richard Honeywood. You alone ensured that I would get to play one of my favorite games ever, and helped to revolutionize the localization process. You are an absolute badass, and you have my utmost respect. Number 7. Mass Effect Legendary Edition. Okay, I hear you. Yes, it is absolutely cheating to put 3 games in one entry, but there's a good reason for that. So often people ask me what my favorite Mass Effect game is, and I don't really have an answer for them. Normies, along with the gaming media of the time, will claim Mass Effect 2 to be an untouchable masterpiece, while 1 and 3 had potential, but were disappointing at best. This narrative has gotten to the point where plenty of people will tell you to just play 2 and forget the rest of the series, and thankfully those mongrels will be taken care of by the Inquisition. I find this pedestalization of Mass Effect 2 in comparison to the other two games to be an understandable but myopic mischaracterization of the entire series. With Mass Effect, BioWare wanted to go big or go home, which is an attitude that largely came from it being their first real IP. Up to that point, they'd worked with Dungeons & Dragons, Star Wars, made a sequel to MDK, and then did Jade Empire, which was inspired by Chinese mythology. Now that they had the experience, it was time for them to do something all their own, something they were truly passionate about. Thus, this is a series that, from its conception, was planned as a trilogy. This isn't something that devs have the cojones to try anymore, and frankly I can hardly believe Microsoft published it. But this was back when Xbox was hungry to compete in the gaming space, instead of having whiny soy boy Phil Spencer saying stuff like, "We're not in the business of outcasting Sony and Nintendo. Everybody's already part of an ecosystem, guys. You can't just make great games and expect to get a market share." You know, except for that one time that Xbox stole half of Sony's market share because they made better games for the first 3 years of the generation. I guess he doesn't remember that because 100% of Xbox's success came before his time for some reason. Anyway, BioWare wanted Mass Effect to be an unprecedented game series, something that was incomparable to anything else, and even to this day that's still fairly true. While other series like The Witcher, The Banner Saga, and Trails used ported over save data, it's mostly used for minor changes in dialogue or maybe a character cameo. We have yet to see a series as interconnected as Mass Effect, which is quite a shame because even Mass Effect is often viewed for what it could have been rather than what it was, but its still uncontested status just shows how truly ahead of its time it really was. This connective tissue is why it's difficult to single out one game over another. That's not to say that the series is homogeneous, though. In fact, it's quite the opposite. Mass Effect 1 draws you into its sci-fi universe with every interaction. The Citadel feels warm and welcoming, like a vast playground for you to explore this new universe and meet all of its inhabitants, which is then perfectly contrasted by the empty, uncharted worlds that instill in you the horrific vastness of space and the insignificance of the galaxy's impending doom when juxtaposed with the infinity of the universe. This is the game that gets you invested in the world of Mass Effect, while at the same time providing the most compelling main plot, focusing on a galaxy-wide chase that leads you to one chilling revelation after another. It also has the deepest role-playing that the series has to offer, even if the gameplay and graphics weren't all there yet. Mass Effect 2 then drops a lot of the exploratory focus of the first, and some of the RPG elements as well, instead offering a more personal experience. This time you aren't introduced to as many new species, but in ME2 you have twice as many companions as the other games. The main plot is mostly non-existent, or at least it takes a major backseat, which is why 2 is often referred to as a side quest in the context of the trilogy. You spend the majority of the game gaining your new squadmates' trust to prepare for the endgame where everything goes to hell. Whereas the first game was world-driven, Mass Effect 2 is character-driven, and I think that's what makes people like it so much. World-driven themes aren't as interesting to the layman because they require a lot of investment as well as prior knowledge to fully appreciate. They are, in a sense, unrelatable, which is what makes the fantasy genre difficult to get into in the first place. 2's combat system, while a significant change from 1, is still thoroughly underbaked, but the fidelity and writing both take a significant leap. Mass Effect 3, by comparison, is plot-driven. This is where all your pigeons come home to roost, and everything you did in the trilogy up to this point is taken into account, in one way or another. 3 fully delivers on the sense of scale that the term space opera should demand, ironing out the presentation issues of 1 and 2 to the point where it was one of the best-looking games of the year, while also providing an incredibly deep, satisfying gameplay loop and an enormous multiplayer suite that is still played to this day. But what's lost in return is almost all elements of role-playing. And, you know, having bar none the most controversial ending in video game history is a bit of a mark against it. But don't you see? The pieces of the trilogy each have their own strengths that are unique to that game alone, and the weaknesses of each game are covered by another game in the series, meaning that regardless of player, there's always something there for you. Therefore, there is no best and worst Mass Effect game because there is no Mass Effect 1, 2, and 3. It's not a series of 3 games. It is simply a perfectly balanced 3-act epic of gargantuan proportions called Mass Effect, the likes of which we will almost certainly never see again. Now, these top 6 games are in a special category for me. Video games are still a very young discipline. We're still experimenting, trying to figure out what works and what makes video games special in comparison to other mediums. Video games are still, by the vast majority of people, considered to be pure entertainment, something to have fun with and then move on with your day, like a toy or candy. A few players want games that are more serious, more meaningful, and can encompass the full breadth of human experience. But the vast majority of gamers are perfectly content sitting in their bubble of FPS, MMOs, MOBAs, live service, simulators, cozy games, what have you. And if a game isn't immediately fun or precisely to their tastes within the first half hour, they'll put it down and go back to their regularly scheduled session of Apex, League, Overwatch, or Genshin that makes them want to, what can I even say on YouTube these days? Engage in auto-annihilation? This is the way that every medium begins. It's first seen as pure frivolity, and only many decades later do we say, this has meaning and value, this is art. Video games, and especially gamers themselves, still have a lot of growing up to do, and I think now we're in the middle of a sort of identity crisis, similar to that experienced by painters upon the invention of the daguerreotype that forced artists to re-find what made their medium special. At the time, the realism movement was in full swing, which was a style that attempted to capture reality as it was, authentically with no frills. But with the advent of early photographs, cameramen could capture the real world with greater ease and accuracy than artists ever could, which left many of them out of work. Thus, artists were forced to remember painting's unique strength, depicting what can't be seen with the lens of an eye or camera. Which is of course what led into the much more experimental modernist period with the Impressionist, Fauvist, and Expressionist movements, where the focus returned to styles, brushwork, color, lighting, and emotion that couldn't be captured by a camera. For the last 3 generations, or perhaps you could even say reaching all the way back to early arcade games like Pac-Man and Donkey Kong that had some of the first cutscenes, video games have largely tried to copy film and television. This, in many ways, has been in an effort to legitimize the medium, when this is clearly misguided. Video games are not movies, nor are they TV. They are a distinctive art form with its own personal pros and cons, and attempting to make them into ersatz cinema will only dilute and distract from what the medium is actually good at. While I understand the frustration with gaming's perception among the general public, and with the takes of myopic critics that have aged like milk, pandering to these pseudo-intellectuals will get this medium nowhere. It is simply a matter of time until a new art form is legitimized in the public eye. Merely look to mediums even older than ours, like graphic novels and animation, which are still struggling to be taken seriously by the masses. That said, these 6 games exhibit what I hope video games will one day be recognized as: a medium with its own unique strength that no other styles of artistic expression can touch. People far smarter than I'll ever be believe that strength to be interactivity. This is the only thing that other art mediums can't do. They can be experienced, contemplated, and convey a meaning to the audience, but we can't communicate with them. We can't have a dialogue, an argument. We can't test ourselves against them. This, then, is what makes video games unique, and I think these 6 games are proofs of concept for that unique strength. The tip of the iceberg for what will one day become mankind's strongest form of artistic expression, a program that you can converse with. That conveys meaning not just through dialogue, music, cinematography, and aesthetics, but the mechanics of the game itself. These Uber games, if you will, show me what this art form is capable of, once we let it off the leash. Number 6. Silent Hill 2 Saigo no Uta, or Poem of the Final Moment. Silent Hill 2 was a game I first played on PS2 at a friend's house when I was way too young, and aside from scaring the bejesus out of me, I didn't really understand anything that was going on. That said, somewhere deep in my subconscious it had planted its roots in me, and years later, as a teenager, I got my hands on the Xbox version and played it, but it felt different this time. It finally started to click. Even though at the time I maybe understood 3% of the game's story, symbolism, and implications about the human experience, it was enough to get my journey started. After that, I became obsessed with Silent Hill 2 to an unhealthy degree, learning everything I could about it to try and understand it just that little bit better. This was around the time that I first finished KOTOR 2 as well, and little did I know these two works would be the jumpstart of my intellectual awakening, the first sparks of my curiosity about the world I inhabited, and would later become crucial foundations of my worldview. For nearly the entire summer of 2010, and even once school started back up, practically all I did was research, replay, and theorize about these two games. That was a damn good summer, man. This was a cycle that would repeat itself for most of my life. I find something that really grabs me and focus on it indefatigably until my interest is finally sated, usually to the detriment of every other aspect of my life, but that level of fixation has allowed me to understand said topics in a more visceral way than most people are able to achieve, and it's become inseparable from my creative process. More than anything, what captivated me so much about Silent Hill 2 was the characters. This is an easy game to spoil, so for those who haven't played it, I'll try and dance around the more sensitive bits. The very town of Silent Hill itself, similar to the Force, is a character with its own desires and goals. Though these are never stated outright, they can be inferred based on the town's interactions with its denizens. Each person in Silent Hill is here for a specific reason, and while there are multiple interpretations of their actions and even their identities themselves, they all serve the central theme of the game, which is a question best posed by our protagonist. While we start the game on a simple mission to find our wife, and we control James Sunderland, a man who could at first be taken for a, as much as I hate to use this misnomer, typical generic Luke Skywalker character, who James is becomes more and more clear to us over the course of the game, until we're hit with a revelation that changes our view of every character and the world itself irreparably. And it's this turn that spawned my central questions. Who am I, and what does it mean to be a good person? James wasn't who I thought at all. Far from generic, he is instead the ultimate player insert, analogous to humanity itself, and that is the crux of what makes this story so timeless. But it's not just the story that matters. Every single aspect of this game serves to inform and enhance the story. This is a video game with a capital G. It was one of the first games to utilize the unique strengths of the medium in an effective way, and in so doing crafts a flawless experience that can only be played if it is to be understood. It's no wonder that Silent Hill 2 is still touted as one of gaming's earliest examples of art. It galvanized the horror game renaissance of the early to mid-aughts. It showed the masses that you could do more with horror games than just mindless zombie gore fests, and it's a game that only gets better every time I play it. It introduced me to terrifying new ideas, ripped my spurious values asunder, and burned away the deadwood of my social programming, allowing me to become a far better person than I would have otherwise. And in the end, isn't that what psychological horror is really all about? Now, I was going to take some time to talk about the Silent Hill 2 remake a little, but I have a bit I'd like to say about it, so I'm going to split that off into a different video. Again, I know, I'm sorry, but you won't have to wait a year for this one, I promise. Seeing the discourse surrounding the remake has taught me that the community's collective understanding of this game is unacceptably poor, so it looks like I'm gonna have to take it upon myself to educate everyone a little bit. For now, all that I'll say is, if you were already a fan of Silent Hill 2 and you enjoyed the remake, please contextualize your praise for it with the reminder that the remake is not, and should never be, considered a replacement for the original. If, however, you played the remake as your first experience with Silent Hill 2, then I wholeheartedly encourage you to play the original as well. They are very different games, and again, regardless of what you think of the remake, the original still stands on its own as one of the greatest games of all time. Number 5. Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice. Hellblade is the antidote to every single problem plaguing the games industry for the last 15 years. Developers today use focus group testing and design by spreadsheet to make games that appeal to every possible player that they can. Hellblade has a clear creative vision that they knew would only appeal to a small demographic of hardcore players. In fact, Hellblade actually has an even larger retirement rate than Dark Souls. Games today have so much scope creep that they shoehorn in every single gameplay mechanic and style from every genre that they possibly can, making a Frankenstein's monster of a game that has 20 gameplay elements that are all underbaked, unfinished, and lack depth. Hellblade has only a few mechanics that it honed in on to deliver a packed experience. Games today need massive 9-figure budgets, even 10 figures if Rockstar is to be believed. Hellblade cost $10 million to make, a budget that would have been considered AAA back in the 6th generation. Games today need enormous publishers and investment boards in order to garner these comically oversized budgets. Hellblade was self-funded and self-published. Games today are too expensive to make. To fund these graphically gorgeous games, they need to raise the price to $70, all while removing content from the base game to be drip-fed back to you in $100+ pre-order collector's editions and over years of live service DLC and expansions. Plus, all cosmetics are removed to be locked behind a paywall with no reasonable way to earn them in-game. Hellblade released Feature Complete for $30, buying the game would also give you the VR version, and it was still one of the best looking games of the year. Games today take too long to make. The typical dev cycle is as long as an entire console generation, and they need corpulent, overbloated teams of hundreds if not thousands of devs and contractors who will all get fired once the minimum viable product has been delivered, because we have to make that quarterly profit margin look a little bit better. Hellblade was made in 3 years with 20 devs and no revolving staff. Games today need huge open world with endless things to do and a wealth of player choice. Hellblade is a focused, linear game with no alternate paths. Every game today needs to be 50+ hours long, with tons of insipid side content that people need to slog through in order to feel like they're getting more bang for their buck. Hellblade is 8 hours of all killer, no filler. Every single mechanic and storytelling beat is integral to the experience, and it knocks out the fat. Why would Ninja Theory choose to do this? Why would they go against the grain like this? Well, largely because they had to. If you read the independent AAA proposition on Hellblade's website, a 2014 GDC talk by Ninja Theory's creative director Tamim Antoniadis, he details the more than a dozen projects that he brought to publishers in the year after the release of DMC Devil May Cry. Every single one was shot down because they weren't generic enough. Can you add multiplayer? Could you do something with Space Marines or superheroes? Could you set it on Mars? No horror, it doesn't sell. Hell, they couldn't even get a Melee game funded, period. This is a developer that worked with some of the biggest publishers in the industry, Microsoft, Sony, and Bandai Namco, all of whom were conveniently absent when it came time to do their job and market the game, and of course took none of the blame when those games inevitably undersold. They couldn't get anything published anyway, so essentially Tamim said, and I believe this is a direct quote, fuck it, we ball. They made a game that they wanted to make, a game that they were passionate about, a game with an original premise that had never been done before, a game that they didn't know if they'd be able to pull off, didn't know how much backlash they'd receive for its themes and content, didn't know if word of mouth alone would be a powerful enough force to make the game successful, or if anyone would even like it. But upon release, it was the first unmitigated win in the company's 17-year history. Even though the gaming community at large wasn't ready for it, it was still received warmly and was hugely successful. It gave an unflinching look into the world of someone with mental illness, allowing you to walk just a few miles in their shoes, and doing so with a level of prudent sensitivity and adroitness that few other art pieces can compete with, regardless of medium. At the same time, it marries this already intense experience with a rumination on mortality, trauma, and grief that will resonate with anyone, thereby severing the perceived distance between you and Senua and allowing empathy to break through. Hellblade not only gave me new appreciation and curiosity for an all too often misrepresented neuroatypicality, but it allowed me to truly step out of my subjective experience for the first time, and unlock a superpower that we all have deep inside, even though so many of us have forgotten how to use it. That superpower is love and understanding for our fellow man. Now, I don't need to play devil's advocate anymore, because there is no devil, just a bunch of people that are as hurt, broken, and confused as me, looking for the same answers as me. And one of those answers I found because I took the time to look at life through Senua's eyes. This game is probably one of the most harrowing, visceral, anxiety-inducing experiences you can have with anything you could call entertainment.
What's fun about Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice?
Nothing.
Really?
Yeah.
As such, Hellblade isn't for everyone, but to me, it is acutely and transcendently beautiful. Not only that, but Hellblade shows us the winning formula to make a game successful. You know it, I know it, and Sven Vinka knows it. I want shorter games with worse graphics made by people who are paid more to work less. I want games made with passion and vision, games that are designed by a human being, not by an algorithm or haphazardly slapped onto a boring open world, and certainly not designed by a committee of the most talentless, parasitic bottom feeders that humanity has to offer. I want games that the developers themselves want to play, games that they can't stop playing, and not because they're addictive, but because they're fun, engaging, and meaningful. I want 100% of my money to go to the actual artists instead of worthless publishers who have never played a video game in their lives. And I want to see every dead genre from years past make the same comeback that Metroidvanias have. Hellblade showed us that indie and self-publishing are the future of gaming, the only future worth believing in. If you're unaware, Tamim has since left Ninja Theory and seemingly game development altogether after only working on Hellblade 2 for the pre-production and transitional phases, and I think his irreplaceability is self-evident when comparing Hellblade with its sequel. It's a terrible loss of one of the industry's strongest up-and-comers, and I sincerely hope Tamim comes back to game development someday. The medium really needs more minds like his. Number 4. Spec Ops: The Line. Going in, I knew Spec Ops would be the most difficult game for me to talk about, for a couple of reasons. Firstly, the game is best experienced as blind as possible, but even though very few people have actually played the game, intermediate gamers will have at least heard of the name at some point, and when they did, they also likely heard about a certain moment halfway through the game that has generated the vast majority of the discourse surrounding it. Similar to MGS2, this game is so much more than just this moment, and even if that aspect has been spoiled for you, it's a game that you should experience for yourself in its totality to fully understand and appreciate everything that it's trying to do. So, go play it. For those of you who somehow have no idea what this game is about, you should also stop watching this video right now, go play it, and come back. It's only a 5-hour game, I can wait. Go on. What to do. Heard the new Overwatch character's pretty cute, and that could take up a couple hours. Oh shit, wait, are you still here? I'm sorry, it just slipped my mind. You can't play this game anymore. It was delisted from online stores due to music licenses running out, so the only way to play it is to buy a PS3 or 360 and play it there. Oh, what's that? You don't have $150 to buy a console that's no longer manufactured and an overpriced secondhand copy? $150 that the developers and publisher will never see a penny of? Well then, find a way to play it. I'm dead serious. The publisher doesn't want to make money off of it or maintain the rights to it anymore, and they refuse to let libraries carry it. It's abandonware. It belongs to the public now. That's the way that orphaned works have always been treated. Just because the law hasn't kept up with the times doesn't excuse book burning via negligence. Also, it's not illegal. The only thing about emulation that is illegal is the distribution, not the usage. If you need help, shoot me a message and I'd be glad to point you in the right direction. The second reason that this game is difficult to talk about is that pretty much everything that can be said about it already has been, and it's up to your own personal interpretation what you want to take away from it. So, for those 3 of you that have actually played the game, I want to clear up a misunderstanding about its meaning that I find to be irksome. Spoiler territory, folks. Please skip to the timestamp on screen if you haven't played the game. Spec Ops: The Line isn't trying to say that you killing someone in a video game is equivalent to killing someone in real life. The game takes a critical look at the mindset of both Walker and the player, and asks them how they got into this situation in the first place. If I had to sum up the theme of Spec Ops, it would be the loading screen toward the end of the game that asks the player, "Do you feel like a hero yet?" Walker can't see himself as anything but the heroic cowboy who comes in and saves the day. Everything that happened in Dubai could have been avoided if Walker had stayed on mission, i.e. confirmed that there were survivors and then radioed for evac. Then there could have been an actual rescue effort, but Walker keeps digging himself further and further into a hole, the same way that we keep descending into Dubai throughout the game. He keeps going off script, moving the goalposts, and tries to justify his actions in any way he can, and by continuing to push forward to try and offset all the sunk cost in the form of human lives. But the truth is, all of this was avoidable if Walker didn't want to play the hero, if he had considered for even a moment that he could do the wrong thing, even with the best intentions. The game is critical of the player in the same way. It's important to note that this game came out at the absolute zenith of gung-ho America fuck yeah military shooter popularity, right after the release of Modern Warfare 3, the good one, and Battlefield 3. We also know that many of these military shooter games were partially funded by the US Armed Forces, and they caused enlistment numbers to skyrocket. Spec Ops takes advantage of our preconceptions that this game is going to make us feel like an awesome super soldier who comes in and saves the day. A hero. The game then throws that preconception in our face and dares us to keep playing, keep ignoring the consequences until we finally can't anymore. I understand people's issues with the game, and in particular the WP sequence, but I think they are, intentionally or otherwise, shifting blame away from themselves, just like Walker. Spec Ops isn't a game that wants you to stop playing it or to make you feel bad for playing it, I think, but it is a game that advocates for its own obsolescence. As in, if you and Walker didn't have a lot in common, you wouldn't be playing the game in the first place. At the very least, it says something about the player that we would seek out this type of entertainment. No, Spec Ops The Line and Hellblade aren't fun. They're not supposed to be, and that's okay. Due to the youth of the medium, we still have a misconception that video games must be mindless entertainment and can never be anything more, but that viewpoint is slowly fading. Even though they're still in their infancy, I think video games are humanity's most potent art form. That in mind, art can and should evoke the entire spectrum of human emotions and experiences, not just simple fun. And for me, the very idea that a game could make you feel bad for the mere act of playing it is an enormous step in the right direction. Number 3. Eco. I don't know how to talk about Eco in such a short time frame, especially when I'm planning a long-form analysis of it in the near future. How could I possibly boil Eco down to its core elements and distill that into a blurb that will get people to play it? Frankly, I can't, so I won't. It will have to suffice for me to say that Eco is the Citizen Kane of video games. The first real and pure example of gaming's potential as an art form. Eco is the best game you've never heard of. It's your favorite game developer's favorite game, and it's the most important game of all time, not only due to its influence, but because it remains, after 23 years, the best prototype for what this medium can accomplish. As such, even talking about it as much as I have does it a horrific injustice. It simply must be played. So, go play it. Don't watch a long play, don't listen to an analysis, actually play it. Emulate the PS2 version, get the PS3 collection, both are good. Just play it. Then, and only then, come back and we can talk about it. Thank you, Ueda-san, for making such an incredible game. One that revolutionized my view of the medium, of art, and the human experience forever. Number 2. Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic 2 The Sith Lords with TSLRCM, the Sith Lords Restored Content mod. If it's not clear by now, the closer we get to the top of the list, the harder it is to talk about these games. There's so much emotion and personal significance mixed up in them that I could talk about them for hours and hours. These are all games that shaped who I am today in dramatic ways, and never is that more true than with KOTOR 2. Now, there are a lot of games that could lay claim to the title of Best Video Game Narrative, more than I could possibly list here, and I've played a fair number of them at this point, including Xenogears just last year. That said, thus far, none of them have yet toppled what I consider to be the best narrative in the medium, KOTOR 2. It follows my favorite style of writing in that it's in no way plot-driven. KOTOR 2 first takes a diverse cast of well-realized characters and puts them in a fleshed-out world. From there, the story essentially writes itself as different ideals clash with one another, and then the plot springs forth from said character interactions. In my opinion, this is how one must write if you want to have believable, relatable characters, which is why this style is so foreign to us in the 21st century. Most stories nowadays are constructed with a bunch of dramatic plot beats that the author wants to hit, and then the characters are written around this outline in order to make it happen. While a few authors like Yoko Taro have mastered this style, as we've so often seen, especially in Star Wars media of late, this almost always results in cardboard cutouts disguised as characters that only exist to serve the author's whims. They have no agency, no wants of their own aside from what the plot demands of them. KOTOR 2 taking the opposite approach leads to a depth and quality of character writing that is entirely unmatched in gaming, including my favorite character in all of fiction, who would make this game worth playing by herself. This is why understanding each character is so key to this game. If you can't connect with certain characters and their viewpoints, then the entire thing could fall flat for you. But the same is true of any well-written story. It takes a lot from the audience to grasp, and you'll need to put in the work. Similar to Xenogears, KOTOR 2 has a vast array of pieces that fit together like a jigsaw, and the more of those pieces you place, the more fulfilling the narrative becomes. Among these pieces is the protagonist herself. Unlike the first game where we are more or less a blank slate, the Jedi Exile is a character with a long history and an established set of traits. However, the dialogue choices over the course of the game allow us to influence who we want her to be, and retroactively mold her into a more defined character. This is similar to the way that Commander Shepard is handled in Mass Effect 1, but with a far greater degree of choices available to us depending on our build, alignment, even gender. Because although the Jedi Exile is canonically female, you can still make a male protagonist if you wish. Which leads me into what is possibly the most special aspect of KOTOR 2, the ludonarrative. I know, ludonarrative in an RPG, who would have thunk? KOTOR 2 can't be thematically summarized in short order, as again, the amount and depth of philosophical inquiry, to me, still remains unparalleled by any other video game. However, one of the most central ideas of KOTOR 2 is the search for truth and perspective. This is best exemplified by the game's main villains, the titular Sith Lords. They are, far and away, the most polarizing and poorly understood characters in all of Star Wars media, and whether or not you can connect with them is down to your own intellectual rigor. To say it in another way, this is the only Western RPG I've ever played where multiple playthroughs of the game with different builds, alignments, genders, and roleplay philosophies are absolutely integral to understanding the game. KOTOR 2 is about studying a problem from every angle, to stare at a question through every lens. Only afterward, once you've steel-manned your opponent's arguments, and you've straw-manned your own, when you've philosophized with a hammer, only then can you truly become whole.
It is to surrender yourself, to make yourself a slave to a teaching or belief that makes it so that belief will always rule you. If you are to truly understand, then you will need the contrast, not adherence to a single idea.
This is what makes KOTOR 2 the ultimate Western RPG. This genre is largely about doing multiple playthroughs and seeing everything there is to see, but never before has this been so intimately tied to the meaning of the work. Aside from the story, KOTOR 2 also fixes just about every problem from the first game, featuring a more in-depth combat system with far greater customization options, greater depth of roleplay, doing away with the infantile binary deontological morality, having far more and far better companions with an added influence system, and praise be, fewer turret sections. Unfortunately, as some of you may know, due to publisher constraints, this game was made in little over a year by a brand new studio, and as such, they weren't able to finish it on time before it was rushed out for Christmas. So not only does it remain a buggy experience, but incomplete as well. However, it was such a rush job that most of the unfinished code was still left in the game, and over years of painstaking work, modders have restored nearly all of what was cut from the game, which can be found in the Sith Lord's Restored Content mod on Steam. Install this first, and choose the version without M478E. This was a planet that was originally supposed to be in the game, but almost no leftover code could be found for it, so it's all fan-made content, and sorry to the team, but it really sucks. Second, after installing TSLRCM, download the community patch by a future pilot on Deadlystream. After that, the game should run fairly well, so enjoy the best Star Wars game ever made. The 20th anniversary of its release is coming up in a couple months, when I wrote this. And it's my birthday too, actually, so every year when December 6th rolls around, it's become a ritual to play as much KOTOR 2 as I can. I played it for the first time as a tween, and most of it went squarely over my head, but I knew I had come across something truly special. Now, a decade and a half later, After playing it over 36 times, and having experienced some of the greatest art in every medium, it still stands tall among giants as one of the most deeply personal narratives I've ever encountered, and it's become the central pillar of my worldview. There's always another layer to unravel in this dense, pensive character drama, wrapped inside of a metatextual deconstruction of humanity's most prolific mythos. That's why I'll be playing this game till I die, and I live for the day that it can be supplanted as my favorite video game story. Also, I hate even having to answer this question, but yes, you have to play KOTOR 1 first. Don't worry, I've heard it's pretty good. Before we get to the last entry, here are some games that just missed the list in a loose worst to best order.
I see you shiver with anticipation.
Number 1. Nier Automata. Does Nier Automata have the best narrative in video games? As we've covered, no, probably not. While the story and characters are beautifully written, and it hits every emotional and thematic beat that it attempts with precision and gravitas, the story does lack a certain element of universality, which drags it down a bit for me. Don't get me wrong, the story of Nier Automata is flawlessly executed in just about every way, but it's the content itself that presents an issue. While it deals with themes that couldn't be more relevant in the 21st century, the story could fall entirely flat for someone who, to steal a line from Hellblade, hasn't died yet. That death will probably come at some point for a lot of people, but because of the subjective nature of value structures, and given the depth of solipsism that your typical NPC is operating on, it's unlikely that a game like this will be the catalyst of said death due to the lack of a shared experience with the player. Therefore, I think people who haven't already died at least once will bounce off of this narrative quite hard, and I've seen this hypothesis come to fruition multiple times. Essentially, it's not a good story for dumb people. Yes, I am having to dive into the theoretical efficacy of the narrative in order to criticize it, but, well, those are just the types of hairs you have to split when talking about stories that are this damn good. It could also be said that while Nier Automata's gameplay is an enormous step up from the original release of its predecessor, it's still far from the best I've ever played. Even among other hack-and-slash RPGs, and even without bringing Souls-likes into the argument, its combat is still outshone by the likes of Dragon's Dogma, and you can make arguments for Ys 8 and Kingdoms of Amalur as well. Automata's combat lacks evolution throughout the game, giving you little in the way of new abilities to radically change up your tactics. Though the switches to shmup and twin-stick sections are an interesting flip of the script, their simplicity will leave fans of either genre thoroughly whelmed, and as such, they're wisely used mostly as small asides to the main gameplay, rather than being treated as an alternative main dish. The prevalence of diarrhea Christmas lights, to yoink a term from girlfriend reviews, and a camera that can occasionally leave you out in the cold also makes some fights feel unfair on harder difficulties. Nier Automata might have the best OST in any game? Whoa, I'm just saying it might, okay? Like, it's possible. I'm not making any definitive statements here. I mean, come on, guys. There's certainly plenty of other games to consider, and while I have my preferences and biases, I'm not nearly musically inclined enough that I could attempt an objective rating. But I will say it easily tops my list in that regard. However, and I think this is something that can be said of a lot of JRPGs, it lacks subtlety in its implementation. Let me give you some examples. You can't have moments like this without moments like this. You can't have moments like this. Without moments like this.
All quiet!
Nier Automata almost always has music playing, and while all of it is absolutely gorgeous, it gets very little time to breathe. It's rare indeed when there's mere ambiance or just nothing at all. Over time, this has the effect of the music fading into the background and becoming less noticeable. It can also lead to a couple of the area themes getting a bit stale as you get further into the game. Again, this is a very common problem with JRPGs in general. I'm not singling out Automata here, but it remains an aspect of pacing that some directors struggle with. If you don't have the ebb and flow, if you don't let the tension reset, if you don't give your music and your listener time to breathe, then even the best soundtrack won't be as impactful as it could be. Having times of ambiance and silence is, in my view, just as important as having incredible music, because it's that contrast that makes an already great OST truly shine. The aesthetics of Automata are probably one of its weaker points. While they are visually appealing, evocative of the themes, and contain a fair amount of visual storytelling, what is lacking is a distinctive artistic style. It tries to find a sort of middle ground between realism and anime that ends up looking somewhat bland and unfocused. It's not as bad as many modern JRPGs. I mean, I dare you to tell apart Tales, Ys, Genshin, and Xenoblade just from the visuals if you've never played them. But still, Automata's visuals are far from iconic, and do little to set it apart from a dozen other games. So what about the ludonarrative then? Surely if it's at the summit of this particular top 6, it must have the greatest ludonarrative of any game, right?
Wrong.
While it is close, I think at the very least Ico, and maybe Spec Ops: The Line, use their game mechanics to tell their stories to better visceral effect. Well, I mean, come on, at the very least this must be the most affecting game for you. That's the criterion this list is based around, isn't it? Again, I hate to say it, but no. As far as my own personal experience with these games is concerned, I think KOTOR 2 and Ico resonated with me far more. Hellblade 2. Those are all games that changed my life in monumental ways that Automata simply didn't do to the same degree. I absolutely adore this game, sure, but to say that this is the game that means the most to me would be a lie. Hopefully, by now you're asking yourself, what is the point in me saying all this? Why would I be criticizing and negatively comparing this game so much if it's in the #1 slot? After all, I said at the beginning that I'd avoid criticism, but I just went over how this game isn't the best in any of the standards that I judge a game on. Well, it's all to contextualize my central argument, which is that Nier Automata isn't the best at any one aspect of video games, but it's one of the best at every single one of them. Unlike so many other games that only do one or two things very well, or are filled with glaring issues, Nier Automata is the whole package. True lightning in a bottle. A miracle. As a video game, as an experience, it's as close to perfect as I think any game has ever been, or for that matter, will be for the foreseeable future. In my opinion, Nier Automata is not just subjectively, but objectively, the best video game that has ever been created. And that's why, as of 2024, it's my favorite game of all time. Finally, I'd like to clear up 4 quick things about the game which newcomers get confused on. First, the endings. People who aren't familiar with the game get intimidated when they hear that there are 26 endings, one for every letter of the alphabet. This is often misunderstood and not very well explained. For starters, while the game has many credit sequences, Automata has one ending, Ending E, the true end. How you achieve this ending is as follows. You play the game the first time, you get Ending A. This will be roughly 12 hours. Then you start up a new game, and proceedings will seem very similar to the first playthrough in the beginning sections, but keep playing. While it may not seem like it at first, this is an integral part of the story. After this second playthrough, which is roughly 10 hours, you'll get Ending B. Start a new game, and everything will be different from before, which beautifully juxtaposes the B route that, in fairness, does require a lot of faith from the player. After this playthrough that lasts roughly 8 hours, you'll get either Ending C or D. Start a new game and you'll immediately be met with that same ending. Choose the other option and you'll get either Ending C or D depending on which you didn't get the first time around. Then, Ending E will start automatically. Aside from the A through E credit sequences, the other 21 credit sequences are all joke endings. You get these by, for example, removing your OS chip, which kills you, blowing up your home base, which kills you, or eating a fish, which gives the player character a new appreciation for the wonders of seafood and a new perspective on part of human culture, and then kills you. They're not meant to be taken seriously, they're just fun little Easter eggs to find if you so choose, and are by no means necessary to finish the game. Second, are the side quests important? Yes. Nier Automata is a much more focused experience than your typical JRPG, and thus it handles its side quests very differently. Every side quest, without exception, is there to inform the narrative, characters, world building, and themes of the game. If you don't do them, then you'll have a vastly inferior understanding of what the game is trying to say. I'd recommend looking up a spoiler-free guide on when you can do certain side quests, as you can be locked out of them based on your progress in the main story. Third, no, you can't save during the intro, and if you die, you'll restart the entire game. You will have the ability to save later on, but not during the intro. Finally, do you need to play the first Nier, or even the Drakengard games in order to understand Nier Automata? No and yes. Nier Automata is a work that can entirely stand on its own in a narrative sense, and no knowledge of the previous games is needed to enjoy it on its own. Automata is not a direct sequel to Nier, as it is set nearly 10,000 years in the future. However, you will be missing how Automata adds to the overarching themes of the series. Similar to how the Metal Gear franchise has an overarching theme of what makes a man, Draken Nier has series-wide themes that cannot be appreciated without the previous entries. There's also plenty of character cameos that you won't have context for. However, knowledge of the previous games is not needed to enjoy Automata itself. So hopefully that helps to clear up some of the more common questions that I get asked about this game and series. I think that if you play in good faith, and if you're willing to put just a bit of yourself on the line to experience something truly special, Nier Automata is far and away the best that this medium has yet to offer. Well, gamers,
it's finished.
This small little passion project that I started back in July to give me a couple weeks break from the Enslaved video of course ballooned into a much larger affair, all whilst I neglected to work on it as much as I should have. But hey, that's just my process at this point, I suppose. After this, I'll get back to working on the Enslaved video. Still no ETA on when that'll be dropping. All I can say is, stay tuned. Hopefully you enjoyed this one though. In several years, I'll do an update to this list, and I'll get to see how much my perspectives have evolved on the games that stay on it, as well as how many new games dot the list. Hell, maybe something will even take Nier Automata's crown. Ask me 8 years ago, and never in my wildest dreams would I have said that one day I would like a game more than KOTOR 2, but here we are. This list and the updates to it will serve as a nice little time capsule for myself. And along the way, I hope I was able to introduce you to a game or two that you hadn't heard of before or hadn't considered playing. And if you happen to find a new game that you like because of this list, please shoot me a comment. I'd love to hear about it. When I first conceived of this video, I didn't want to make a top X games list like everyone else. If I was going to do this, I wanted to do it right. Which to me meant that it would be a way to tell you a bit about myself, what I value, and the ideas that I find engrossing, while also talking about the thing that I love most. Art. And I think I've been fairly successful in that. This is, without a doubt, my favorite thing that I've written thus far. But enough rambling, that's the end of the list. Of course, I haven't played every game out there, and there are many games that people consider to be great that aren't on this list. So if you're wondering why a specific game didn't make the list, feel free to ask about it in the comments. 9 times out of 10, the answer will probably be that, yes, I've played it, I think it's bad, and I think you're stupid for liking it. I will address one that I know I'll get, though. Yes, I have played the Dark Souls trilogy. Those are the only Souls-likes I've played. And all 3, yes, including 2, I'm sorry if you played Scholar, I think it ruins the game personally, but all 3 would probably be on the list somewhere. However, I haven't played them since they came out. And I don't find it prudent to recommend games that I haven't played within at least the last 3 to 5 years. Regardless, thank you guys so much for watching, have a great day, and go play some games.